Hello everyone. Today, I will be walking you through the Descope console, the central place to configure and manage Descope's human and agentic identity features. First, you can create a new project or select an existing one within your organization from the drop-down in the top left corner here. Once you select a project, the Home tab will provide detailed statistics on user activity, such as active users over time, authentication methods used, and countries and devices of origin. You can see similar statistics for tenants. You can also see security analytics. Flow analytics will show you how many users went down which authentication branch in your flows, which is useful for A/B testing. And finally, you can also see analytics of AI agents accessing your protected MCP servers. Below the Home tab, we have a Getting Started wizard, which can walk you through setting up your first auth methods with Descope. Next, we have one of the big parts of the console, which is the Agentic Identity Hub, which is Descope's control plane and governance system for AI agent identity. The Agentic Identity tab is a full directory of the agentic identities that have connected, which is a combination of the agent and the user behind it. And for each agent, if you click on it, you can see what scope says access to, what method it registered by, and the user that it is acting on behalf of. Next, the MCP servers tab is where you can protect your custom MCP servers by clicking this blue plus, then defining a name and adding the server URL where it is hosted, and then defining MCP server scopes that will be available to your agents, and picking which registration method you want to allow. The Clients tab, as opposed to the Agentic Identity tab, just shows the client information for those clients which have connected. So if we click on this Claude client, we can see its client ID and client secret, along with which grant types it is authorized to use. The Connections tab is where we store the OAuth tokens and API keys that agents need for downstream services. So if I have an agent that needs to go out to GitHub, it'll request those credentials at the moment of use rather than holding on to them. So there is no storage of static credentials. Next up, we have the Build section. The first tab here is authentication methods. As you can see, we have an extensive suite of methods available with an emphasis on passwordless auth. When you select a particular method, you can see and edit the configurations for that method. And notice at the top, you can toggle the ability to access this method from the backend API and SDK. Let's take a look at the social login through OAuth. Descope provides some pre-configured OAuth applications out of the box for testing purposes, but for production usage, you will have to configure your own OAuth apps by putting in client ID, client secret, and other information. Below authentication methods is our Flows tab. You can learn more about flows in a dedicated tutorial, but it's a very powerful visual tool for designing authentication and consent journeys. From the Flows tab, you can create and edit flows, import, export them, and edit other settings as needed. Next is the Widgets tab. Widgets are components that you can embed into your application that allow you to delegate certain operations to your application's users. For example, through the User Management widget, an admin can select many users and then perform certain operations on them. You can fully customize the appearance of this widget, add buttons and containers, and customize the behavior of those components as well. Below widgets is the Styles tab. Here, you can fully customize the logos, colors, fonts, and other design elements that will appear in your Descope flows and components to match your brand's guidelines and visual identity. Next is the Authorization tab, which lets you configure both role-based access control and relationship-based access control. Under the RBAC section, you can view and create your project-level roles and permissions for your application's end user. Descope comes with a few administrative permissions already configured, but you will likely want to create more by clicking on New Role, giving it a name, and then associating some permissions. Under the Fine-Grained Authorization tab, Descope gives you a visual way to define fine-grained access rules for your application. You can start by defining object types in your schema, then defining the relationships between them and the permissions those relationships grant. Finally, we have the Connectors tab. which allows you to integrate your flows with external services to either fetch information or push data during the execution of your flow. We have an extensive list of third-party services available, which you can usually configure just by providing an API key or similar connection endpoint information. Or there are also some generic connectors like this HTTP connector. You can then plug these connectors into your flows just like any other components. Next, we have the Connect section, which covers the different kinds of applications Descope has available. Federated apps can allow you to configure Descope to act as the identity provider. You can configure either a SAML or OIDC app. You can configure a flow that users will sign in through, and then downstream apps will trust Descope for authentication and receive either a standard SAML assertion or OIDC identity token. The configuration information listed under the SP section is what you would give to the service provider so that it can connect to your application. You can use a client ID and access key, or switch to a confidential client to use a client ID and client secret, and here you can see all of that information and Descope's OIDC endpoints. Below, you can also select different grant types. Inbound apps enable your application to act as an OAuth provider with Descope as the OAuth authorization server. Here you can define the available scopes, what roles they are mapped to, different grant types, and the consent flow that the user will go through. So for example, when someone wants permission to access your API, the external app redirects the user to Descope's OAuth authorized endpoint, the user logs in, consents to scopes, and then the external app gets an access token. Outbound apps are the opposite direction. They are for when your app needs to access external services on behalf of a user or tenant. Descope is acting more like a token vault or connection manager for third-party tokens. For example, let's say your application needs to access Gmail. You can connect to Google through Descope, then Descope stores and manages the Google OAuth tokens. Later, your backend can retrieve and use the right token depending on its policies and permissions. Resources are OAuth resource servers you define in the Descope console. There are two types: backend APIs, where scopes are mapped to RBAC roles, or MCP server resources. This is the same as defining an MCP server in the agentic identity hub. You can see here how scopes are mapped to different roles and permissions in a backend API resource. Finally, under the Policy tab is where you can manage Descope's powerful policy engine. These are the authorization rules that govern what each subject can access across your Descope project. For example, here you can see that Claude is only allowed to access one specific resource or MCP server, and it's only allowed to access these specific read-only scopes. Next is the Manage section. The first tab is Users. This shows all of the users that have been created or that have signed into your project using Descope. If you want to invite users manually, you can do so here. You can set user attributes, such as name, email, phone, and you can associate a user with tenants and roles and define access to applications. A user can be a member of multiple tenants, allowing for multi-tenancy scenarios. Next, we have access keys, which enable machine-to-machine authentication for your app, so services can securely authenticate with each other without user interaction. You can create and manage access keys here, which the machine connecting to your application will present in exchange for a JOT token that your application can then validate. Just like users, access keys can be associated with tenants and roles. Next, we have tenants, which are used in B2B scenarios and essentially act as your individual customer organizations or business accounts. So you can build multi-tenant applications while keeping each client's user settings and authorization data completely isolated from each other. Each tenant also has its own configurations. Under authentication methods, you can configure a tenant-level SSO connection through either SAML or OIDC and also skim provisioning. We recommend letting your customers set up their own SSO connections through our SSO self-service setup suite, which you can find the link for under tenant settings. Under authorization, you can create tenant-level roles as opposed to project-level roles, which you can see here, and associate permissions with them just as before. You can also configure tenant-level styles, add users directly to a tenant, and define subtenants, which can inherit certain settings from their parent. The last tab here is Audit and Troubleshooting. Here you can see a full list of audit events within your project, including detailed data for each one. Under troubleshooting, you can see all errors and warnings that have occurred in your project, which flow caused that error, and which specific step inside of the flow. Finally, under flow activity, you can see a detailed breakdown of all flow activity inside of your project. So Descope provides very powerful and detailed auditing capabilities about every single aspect of your project. Under the project tab, you can edit settings which will affect the current project you have selected, such as the project name, approve domains, which will ensure the redirect calls and authentication processes can only be made to the domains listed there. You can also configure user sign-up settings, whether they can join by self-registration or only invitation. You can clone, import, export projects, and finally delete them, which is irreversible. You can configure the properties of JOT tokens issued by your application, such as timeout. And finally, you can fully customize the shape and claims of the JOT tokens issued by your application. Under the Company tab, you can change the company level settings, such as your company name, and how to log into Descope console with your organization. By default, all AI features are disabled in your company, but if you toggle off this checkbox, it will enable powerful AI troubleshooting capabilities for your flows using audit data. You can manage Descopers, people who have access to your Descope console, and their roles. Now this is an important section, management keys. These keys are required to make any management actions through the Descope API or any SDKs. You can create keys here and assign project or company level access with specific roles. If you ever need help finding something in the console, you can use the search bar up here or ask our Docs MCP server to learn more about our features and how to use them. Thanks for watching.